are live. 3 o'clock live stream from Fort Humboldt State Historic Park. And if you're joining our stream, it is a little windy up here today. Let me know if you can hear me okay. Let me know if you can see this face okay. We got a light coming in. I'm hoping that means you can hear, you can see. Very windy day out here on the bluff. Oh, technology. We love to make things more difficult, don't we? Awesome. Thank you, Sandra. Awesome. Thank you guys for your feedback. Oh my goodness. Technology's failing on me. All right. Let's go ahead and turn this off. Okay, excellent. Sorry about that, you guys. Technology being a little bit difficult today. So I'm up on the top of the bluff at Fort Humboldt State Historic Park. We got a little break in the wind, or in the rain, but it's still nice and windy. So I'm gonna try and get in some more covered areas. You guys let me know if the audio is getting really bad from the wind, and I will duck inside if I need to. So we love to show you some of the outdoors and things like that, but if need be, I can go inside and talk a little bit more about this. What I would like to talk about today is one of the groups that spent time at Fort Humboldt. So up here on the north coast in Eureka, there is a historic military fort that was put here to mitigate conflict between a bunch of different groups up here. So I'm going to spend these next couple of live streams kind of talking about the perspective of each of these groups that kind of led to this conflict. So awesome. I see a good couple of you guys tuning in, comments, awesome. Appreciate you guys checking in, letting me know you can see me, you can hear me. Hello, thank you so much for joining in, you guys. Really quick, my name is Kyle. I'm a park interpretive specialist for the North Coast Redwoods District of California State Parks. I work out of this site predominantly. This is Fort Humboldt State Historic Park, and this is a historic park, a historic military fort that's right smack dab in the center of Eureka, which is one of the larger towns up here on the north coast. So if you're familiar with Humboldt Bay, the Humboldt area, this is kind of the big town up here, Eureka, and there's a historic military fort kind of smack dab in the middle of town. If you've ever driven through Eureka, you've driven right past it and may not have ever even noticed. So thank you guys all so much for joining. Really appreciate you guys being here. Thank you so much. And I'm just going to talk briefly about this first group, the soldiers. I'm going to talk a little bit about their experience, how they got to Fort Humboldt, what they were told, some of their misery. And if you guys have any questions, just pop them down in the comments. I'm so very happy to answer your questions and kind of have a dialogue with you about this. I do want to recognize also that this is ancestral Wiyot land, and that we are going to be talking about the indigenous communities in this area. I want to recognize too that there's no perfect term to kind of acknowledge this larger group of indigenous people up here on the north coast. There's a number of different tribes that were affected by this. Although I am in ancestral Wiyot territory, Karuk, Hupa, Wiyot, all kinds of different tribes were affected by the things that happened in this area, and a lot of the events kind of that centered around Fort Humboldt and the military presence here. So with that, I also want to recognize so many of you guys are doing your part to stay home during this COVID-19 pandemic. We really appreciate that. Why am I in the parks while you're home? Well, we're hoping to bring a little piece of what you might miss from the outdoors home to you, give you a little bit of that taste of parks in your home. Our mission for California State Parks is to provide for the health, the inspiration, and education. So we're trying to help you out a little bit with your mental health and give you a little bit of green spaces to enjoy, provide for the inspiration to hopefully come back to these places once they are open again, and to educate you a little bit, tell you a little bit about why we think these places are so cool. So thanks for hanging in there for my kind of lengthy introduction. Let's go ahead and get started talking about the soldiers here at Fort Humboldt. So I want to start over here. This is kind of the era. This is kind of what their uniform would have looked like. And our conflict up here on the north coast starts with gold mining, really bringing people to this area in droves. So people really started coming out here looking for gold, really coming to this area in large amounts, looking to kind of participate in the gold rush. However, it was found pretty quickly that the real wealth up here in the north coast was not from the gold mines, but from the redwoods. the massive trees here. It was said that you could make up to 20 houses out of one of these massive trees. So, you know, lots of cities getting built at that time. This was a very valuable resource. So people really started coming up here, and there was a lot of money to be made in timber. But I want you not to take the perspective of somebody in timber today. I want you to imagine that you were a soldier. And a lot of the soldiers who served up here at Fort Humboldt were not actually career military, but recent immigrants to the United States that were brought into the military upon arrival and shipped up to the North Coast, where they were promised kind of a better life. So, I'd like you to imagine that you are a fresh immigrant to the United States back in 1853. You have just arrived in San Francisco. You don't know necessarily how to start your life here, and somebody comes up to you, somebody in military uniform, and they say, "Hey, I got a great deal for you, okay? Join the military, and we're gonna get you started on your life here in America. We're gonna send you off to the North Coast of California. Beautiful, pristine landscape. We're gonna, you're gonna help us out with the military for a couple years. We got a job to do up there, and you're just gonna work real hard. We'll pay you for it, and when we're done, you're gonna have your claim of some land, and you'll have a good paycheck in your pocket. You can get started on your life. We'll really get you a good head start." So that's where a lot of the soldiers were recent immigrants to the United States. At that time, a lot of people coming in from Ireland, and as they would arrive in San Francisco, they'd have this, someone come up and say, "You've got this great opportunity up on the North Coast of California. Join the military. We'll send you on up there free of charge." Sounds like a pretty good deal. So a lot of people took it. And at that time, again, there was this fighting going on up here on the North Coast between the indigenous communities and the settlers coming in here for timber, gold mining, all kinds of extraction of resources. So essentially the way a lot of these conflicts started was over land, a resource that would be on land that an indigenous community had been living on for thousands and thousands of years. Then you have these people coming in wanting to do resource extraction and remove the people from their land. It's also important to note that at this time there had already been 200 years of conflict with people fighting indigenous communities throughout the United States as people were pushing westward with Manifest Destiny and all of that. People kind of expanding out west through the United States, removing indigenous people from their land, and a lot of conflict ensued around that throughout the entire United States. So by the time people got up to the North Coast, there had been 200 years of that going on, and people were really not very friendly to the indigenous communities here, especially when removing them from their land and things like that. So these conflicts kind of got out of hand. There was a lot of fighting and a lot of bloodshed. So the military decided around 1853 that they needed to intervene, and that is why they started sending the soldiers up here to Fort Humboldt, was to mitigate this conflict between the settlers and the indigenous communities. So you hop on a steamboat at that time. Right now, if you were going from San Francisco to Humboldt, it takes about 5 hours. It's a pretty slick drive, pretty comfortable. Back in those days, it was not so simple, not a comfortable car drive. Instead, it was a ride on a steamboat, and it was said to be around 3 to 5 days. But at that time, Humboldt Bay was not dredged, meaning that the sand, the sand from the bottom of the body of water was up so high that boats had to wait for a certain tide, for the water to be a certain height, for them to actually sail into the bay. So this first steamer carrying U.S. troops coming up to Humboldt from San Francisco, it was the middle of winter. It was cold, it was miserable, it was rough seas. They passed the wreckage of other voyages that didn't make it on their way up here. They got sick, and many of the soldiers died before they even made it up here to the North Coast. And then when they finally got outside of the bay, they had to wait another couple of days for the tides to be high enough for them to sail into the bay. So, what now is about a 5 to 6 hour car drive, what then was around a 5-day boat ride, turned into a 10-day trip in the winter oceans for this first group of soldiers. So by the time that they got here, a lot of them were sick, they were cold, they were relatively miserable, and then they arrived to an absolutely barren bluff. One of the commanding officers saw this bluff across the bay right as they pulled in and wanted to build a fort up on this. So I have a quote from that commanding officer on kind of his first impression on seeing this bluff. Seeing this bluff across the bay. So this is from Colonel Mansfield. seeing the bluff coming into Humboldt Bay. It is well selected in the rear of town on the high ground and commands a good view of the harbor and its entrance. There are 4 little settlements on this bay, thus there is quite an American population on this bay to bring, and a good steam tug to bring in supplies, and a small steamer to commute daily with the different places. There are constant trains of pack mules between Union, which is present-day Arcata, and the Trinity and Salmon rivers. There's a large amount invested in sawmills at Eureka and Bucksport. There's abundant lumber, wood, grazing, fresh beef, and potatoes and barley here. All other supplies come from San Francisco. So there was a number of kind of settlements around Humboldt Bay as these soldiers got up here, but it was not their job to go and get cozy in the local communities. It was their job to march right on up to this bluff, which had absolutely nothing on it. It was the middle of winter, so it was freezing cold, and that first group of soldiers slept right on the ground in this bluff. This is what Eureka may have looked like around that time. This is a, oh, if I can get it to focus, there we go. This is some early artist pictures of what Eureka looked like around 1854, and that's right around the time period we're looking at. This first steamer showed up in 1853, so this is right around the same time. Thanks for tuning in from Australia. That's awesome. Thanks so much for watching. Appreciate it, Andy. So that's kind of the community that the soldiers were showing up to. But again, it was not their job to interact with that. They had to march right on up to this barren bluff. And pretty quickly they realized that these two parties that they were supposed to be mitigating conflict for had competing interests that were almost completely opposite. The settlers wanted to kind of continue moving across land and removing the indigenous people, while the indigenous communities wanted to just stay on their ancestral land and continue doing things the way they had for thousands and thousands of years. So soldiers felt that there wasn't a whole lot they could do going out, and instead they spent time here at the fort building up the buildings. So you can see a couple of them in the distance there. Sorry, I'm kind of hiding behind this bush here. It is windy out here on the bluff today. So imagine how those soldiers might have felt sleeping on that wet winter ground, the cold wind blowing right off of the bay onto them. Sandra asking if were promises kept. No, is the short answer for that. There was a lot of fighting going on during this time with indigenous communities kind of all over the place. This is right around the time of boarding schools and things like that. Indigenous communities, the government was essentially trying to remove their culture from them. So while these soldiers were set up here to mitigate conflict and not necessarily incite any fighting between these two groups or put any weight on helping one group over the other, the government was kind of doing other actions that didn't necessarily support that idea. But the soldiers did, from what we can gather, again, we're dealing with a lot of primary sources written by the soldiers. We're dealing with a lot of their logs and things like that is where we're getting a lot of this kind of primary sources information from. And that's a difficult thing anytime you're dealing with history, that you're going off of what is written or what is told, but you're never really going to get the full and true story because you weren't there. So it's something difficult anytime dealing with history. But from what we know, the soldiers up here at Fort Humboldt were predominantly benevolent to the indigenous communities. And what they spent their time doing was building up this fort as a safe haven for anyone who was looking for shelter. So whether you were a settler or a native person, you could come up to this fort and be treated in the hospital, be taken care of, and that this was a safe place for you to be. That was the idea. This was a miserable experience for the soldiers, though. They were building houses that they were not necessarily invited to sleep in. The higher-ranking officers and prestigious individuals got places to sleep first, while the soldiers building their houses were still sleeping on the ground. And a lot of those soldiers found that just about anything else would be more lucrative than spending time here at the fort. After they got these buildings built, they spent almost all of their time doing rigid drilling, cleaning their weapons, marching around camp, and things like that. I have a quote from one of the soldiers' wives talking about how this lifestyle was so terribly boring and felt kind of miserable up here on this beautiful bluff. So this is from one of the wives of the soldiers. Her name's Clara McGeorge Shields. She says, "Life at the post was insufferably dull. The Indians gave little trouble, and months intervened between the arrivals of mails. There were days and days of rigid drilling and discipline until officers and men became stalled and weary." I know this is super blurry for you guys. Stalled and weary. Commissary whiskey of the vilest kind was to be had in unlimited quantities, and all partook more or less. The combination of whiskey and idleness was followed by the usual results. So soldiers up here were relatively miserable and really bored. The commanding officers were strict, rigid drilling and all of that kind of stuff. So in many cases, a lot of these soldiers during this early time abandoned their posts. It was said at one point, this fort could hold up to 90 soldiers with the buildings it had. And it was said one morning that a commanding officer came out to meet his troops and there was only about 5 remaining because so many had abandoned their posts in the night. Remember that there were delays in the time that they get paid, so they were enduring all of this misery and not necessarily even getting paid for their efforts. So, seeing these other incredibly lucrative career paths all around them, timber, gold mining, all these other industries starting up in the area, it was really common that a lot of the soldiers would desert their posts during this time. And here's another picture here of kind of Fort Humboldt in its prime, all these soldiers doing all this kind of rigid drilling here. Day in and day out. Yes, Andy, I see you. I see you drawing a linear between the things that happen to the Indigenous communities here and what's happened in to Australia's Aboriginal people as well. And that is very unfortunately true for so many Indigenous communities. That culture, lifeways, has tried to be stifled by this. European or westernized culture coming through and trying to dominate. And it's really unfortunate that this has happened, but it's very hopeful that in so many cases people are becoming more and more aware of this, that traditional lifeways and cultural practices are beginning to get revived and kind of brought more out into the light. These are cultures that these people are logical blip there again, that these people are proud of, and rightfully so. And so it's really exciting that these cultures are starting to get more and more shared, more talked about, and brought more into the light, because they deserve that. They deserve to be respected. Sandra, I see you don't blame them for deserting their posts, and no, I don't wholly blame them either for deserting their posts. And Robin, commissary whiskey, yeah, that sounds disgusting. So again, what the soldiers who stayed here ended up doing a lot of the time was getting drunk at night and all of these kind of incredibly rigid drills during the day. And that's how they spent a lot of their time. And the soldiers felt too that it was really hard to kind of intervene in this conflict that they were asked to solve. Because again, these two parties had kind of completely competing ideas on what they wanted. And so the soldiers felt that there wasn't a lot that they could do. Calista, I see you asking, were there trees there during fort times? And the answer is essentially no. This bluff is relatively barren because of its geography. This was at one time, this is an ancient ocean uplifted terrace. This was at the bottom of the ocean. At one point, seismic activity uplifted it, and it's also very close to the ocean. So the redwood trees that dominate this area as being the massive trees don't grow very close to the water. They're intolerant of salt water being sprayed onto them. And it, as today is very windy, that would spray salt pretty far up here onto the bluff. So the redwood trees don't actually grow here. And while there were some trees growing here during the fort, this is a relatively mostly barren natural bluff. So this actually served as a very good place for a fort to be built, being over the top of the bay and relatively clear naturally. And even some of the trees we have today have a hard time with the rain or the wind during the storms. Quite a few months ago now, we had a few fall down. So real quick, I wanted to read you guys one more quote to kind of finish off talking about this soldier's experience. And this is one of the captains talking about their experience with kind of their job to mitigate this conflict. And just to give you an idea of some of the fighting at this time, that there is one documented massacre of indigenous people going after the white settlers coming in. And there's over 50 documented massacres of the settlers going after the indigenous communities. So there was a lot of fighting at this time and a lot of bloodshed. And this is Captain Henry M. Judah kind of reflecting on one of those massacres. He says, "In this, as in 1,000 other instances, the Indians were not to blame. The contest between a party of whites, few in number, who would wantonly exterminate them after disarming them, and the more right-minded who would protect them, both out of humanity and to avoid the disastrous consequences of the retaliation which would certainly be attempted. It's hard that the troops should be called upon to mediate between these competing parties, while they have also to retrain the Indians and try to protect them from destruction." So I feel like that just kind of, sorry about that, encapsulates this struggle that they were experiencing to kind of, how do we deal with this conflict? And that's something I think that it's worth thinking about now too, is how how would we deal with these conflicts? How would, and keep in mind too that you have a modern set of all the history that you've ever learned, a modern set of knowledge, and what is appropriate best practices is continually advancing, and we're always learning on kind of how to treat other people better. But this was over 100 years ago, and the government was not necessarily leading by good example. They were trying to kind of exterminate this culture and had been fighting with indigenous people for 200 years at this point. So when the soldiers arrived here, I want you to take a moment to think about their perspective. And maybe what they did wasn't the best way to deal with the conflict at the time. And with our modern knowledge, we know that. But think a little bit about what position those soldiers were in at that time, what their life was like, what their experiences were like up here at the fort, being so miserable and not necessarily knowing how to handle these issues and not having a whole lot of historical context to go off of. I just think it's really interesting to think at any point during history what those people's mindset was like, what the things were going on through the rest of the world, what kind of information they were dealing with. So for the soldiers at Fort Humboldt, this was a completely different world for them than we live in today. Robin, I see you have a question. How big were the trees when people first arrived there? I assume they're much bigger than the ones that are there now. So again, this bluff was naturally relatively barren of trees and things like that. If there were any trees growing here, they were cut down to help build the buildings and things like that. So this bluff was relatively barren all the way to the edge, and then there were saltwater marshes off of there instead of a mall that's there today. And then in these neighborhoods and things behind the bluff, that's where that dense, massive redwood forest would have been. And again, trees don't grow exceptionally well up here on this bluff, being so close to the ocean, being so windy. It's not really a great place for huge, dense trees to grow, although a couple are doing pretty well. So Calista, I see you say, where were most of the soldiers originally from? The soldiers kind of came from all over the place, but a large group of the soldiers were immigrants, so people who had just arrived in San Francisco from different places around the world. Ireland was somewhere that a lot of immigrants were coming in from that time, and then as they arrived, they were kind of promised this great life up here on the North Coast, serve for the military in a little while, and for a little while, and you'll be provided all of these great opportunities coming out. But there were soldiers also from the East Coast. In one honorable mention, believe this or not, a later president of the United States served at Fort Humboldt for about 4 short months. If you know who I'm talking about, throw it down in the comments. The president who served at Fort Humboldt for only a short time. And then Sandra, I see you asking, does it snow there? It snows exceptionally rarely, and especially here being so close to the ocean. I don't know if it's ever snowed up here on the top of the bluff, but last year we did get a little bit of snow up here in Humboldt. Even in the lower elevations, it just got cold enough, but definitely not regular snow, maybe once a year if we're feeling lucky. And compared to places where it does snow, it's not really snow. But being from California, I like it. I get excited. Does anybody know who that president who served at Fort Humboldt was? It's Grant. Ulysses S. Grant served at Fort Humboldt. He was just a common soldier when he was here. One of his friends said he was a quiet, unostentatious, reserved sort of man who would sit on a store box alone for hours in Eureka, attracting little more attention than if he had been a dummy. I think that is such a beautiful quote to encapsulate someone's experience of someone. So yes, there you go, Robin. I see Grant. Excellent, excellent, excellent. Yes, President Grant served here for a short time. So in closing, I just wanted to hopefully provide a little bit of perspective on what some of the soldiers serving up here at Fort Humboldt were going through. For some of you who probably never knew Fort Humboldt existed, there is a military fort right smack dab in the middle of Eureka, not for active warfare, but to mitigate this conflict between the indigenous communities that were up here on the North Coast and the soldiers coming in. So thank you guys all so much for tuning in. Again, if you have any more questions, you can just pop them on into the chat. I'll be coming back around and answering whatever I can and providing some more information. If you guys like these live streams, be sure to share. We're doing them every single day at 3 o'clock. We really appreciate you guys tuning in. We really appreciate your support, and hopefully this is giving a little piece of that park that you might be missing into your home, providing some great educational opportunities, all that kinds of stuff. We are also following the COVID guidelines out here. We're making sure to sanitize our equipment, stay at least 6 feet away from each other. I've got a mask in my pocket in case anybody comes around. We're doing our best to follow these as well, and most of the time we are stuck indoors. So we really treasure getting to share these experiences with you, give you a little piece of the parks, and we're really happy to share that with you. So thank you guys all so much for tuning in. Any more questions, pop them on down in the chat. We've got another live stream tomorrow at 3 o'clock. Tons of great stuff on our social media stuff to give a little piece of the parks into your home. Thank you guys all so much for tuning in, and we'll talk to you soon.